Welcome to this module on Where's Your Budget? For those of you that have been around for a while, and I probably assume most of you are 50, 55 and better, you probably remember the old commercial, Where's the Beef? And the point with that is simply that there has to be something of substance done with a budget. The idea that you're going to be able to do a simplistic client questionnaire that's usually dumped into a software program where your input for the budget may be a couple of minutes of thought and nothing more than that is just not going to cut it when you're trying to look at a retirement that's going to span up to 30 years. You really have to do some work on this. So let's go into it. Though I must admit that I did decide to throw this in. This is the, as you can see, the accumulated federal deficit. Now on the left-hand side, it just shows as a percent of GDP. I don't care if I put the trillions of dollars or anything else. I think this is indicative of a terrible insight, ability. Basically, it's a lack of concern by the politicians to figure out what we should be doing. I mean, it's one thing when you see some of the difficulties around World War II, but when you start moving up, and I realize there's Afghanistan and so forth, but considering the political rankering that we've seen, it's kind of a sad commentary that they can't get their act together, while at the same time they're looking for everyone else to get theirs in order. The one key issue that I've had stuck in my craw for a very long time is that if somebody came into a brokerage firm and said, gee, I have, well, I could say 10,000, but let's make it as though it was a larger amount of $100,000, and I want to buy stocks or something to that element. Well, you have to understand risk, and you have to know whether it is that attempt at buying stocks, or just about anything else for that matter, is suitable. But if you go down below, it's next to impossible to determine a proper retirement asset allocation, any asset allocation for that matter, for an individual where there's no data, or it's a guesstimate. But particularly, it becomes a very major concern for anybody that's just going to buy something willy-nilly, so to speak, when they're 50 to 55 years of age, because that's where the regular budget comes into contact, as well as the estimate as though you were retired. You just can't do this properly. I know it's done, but I just don't see the viability of it nor the suitability. Now, I do wish to indicate again that all this material is pretty much designed for middle income. If you've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and $1 million and 10 million worth net worth, these modules will do you some good. But you're dealing with some products that take a different focus when you have to look at some of the higher tax rates and so forth. So again, I'm just reiterating, this is for middle America. You have to do the budget. There's just no way that an advisor can sit down and stuff something into a software program that you don't know anything about, they really don't know anything about, because nobody really knows what's going on inside the computer. The problem is how much money will be spent during retirement based on the revised projected budget. When we do this, and obviously I've got a full budget here that you're going to be looking at, you look at what you're spending now, and you simply put in the amount that you would spend as though you were retired now without any increase for inflation, just as though you were retired now. The inflation element, and I'll go through a little bit of this in just a few minutes. But the whole idea behind this, by throwing around a few of these numbers and getting the budget, is getting the amount of the kitty that would be necessary at retirement. Now, these numbers, as it says there, are composed of the anticipated inflation. Right now, the Fed has wanted to get inflation up to 2%. It is under that. They would like to get it up some more. So I make certain allowances in there, a range, if you will, so that I can kind of look at the numbers. I mean, if you want to get an Excel spreadsheet, fine. But I just don't think it's going to do you an awful lot of good, because you're pumping out numbers that cannot be precise at any point, particularly when you're looking at a lifetime. The expected return on the asset allocation ultimately selected. Yeah, that's going to be a tough one, and I think it's going to have to be under 8%. And I'll show you some numbers in just a bit as to what I would kind of look at if, and these you can use if you were going down to an advisor now to see whether you might say you're in line. But when you have bond funds now that are really not going to return anything to speak of unless you take a greater amount of risk, and the returns expected, I realize what happened in 2013. It's an anomaly with the fundamentals by our wonderful government way out of whack on a lot of stuff. Anyway, so now we go down to the lifetime anticipated. If you're 65 and you look at an actuarial table, roughly you have 20 years. I mean, the women are going to be a little bit longer, but it's roughly 20 years, and then you put in a fudge factor. And the other element which has the greatest amount of variation in order to determine, you're going to be high, low, or whatever, is the budget. Now, what we do with all these numbers is use this little formula. I just put it here, I guess, because I'm impressed whatever they did in the 50s or 60s to fill a blackboard like this. Anyway, you will see here that you can do some minor adjustments and so forth, but the budget is the one item that makes the most difference on how much is effectively needed at retirement. And the use of old numbers in making up some of these, some of the inputs that you're going to use on a formula, it's a module called retirement numbers. That's all it is, just doing this and showing you something in a very simple chart that if you had a financial calculator you could do yourself. The one thing I'm going to look at is inflation of 1 to 4%. I usually use a range in some of these numbers, and it used to be higher at 3.5 to 5%. Now, to look at inflation of 1 to 4, obviously you can see that it's less, but I would probably use a 2 and a 4 to feel comfortable that I've covered some range. The 1% is in there because some people have identified the fact that once somebody is retired, they are not buying the same things that they would were they younger, so you can get down to 1%. Again, it's definitely a consideration. I understand what they are dealing with, but there are other things that come up that make me a little uncomfortable. The returns are going to be less than 8%. I've indicated in other modules that the bond funds that people have really relied on for a long time, at least to provide some type of a return, may in fact provide negative returns for some time to come. These are just standard bond funds. Again, can that return on bonds go up? Yeah, but you're going to be taking a risk. Is it going to be high yield bond funds? These get, you have to weigh all of this stuff. So probably a lot of your returns can look at 5 to 7%. Your lifetime, as I said, is 20 plus 5 years, roughly. The issue that you look at there is health and the history that they've had with their parents and so forth. Obviously, if you have somebody that's in very ill health, that's where you just change everything. I had somebody years ago who had both grandmothers live to 100, and so she's really pushed up there, and these are the considerations. Your budget is obviously more of an unknown here, but it can have more of a factor in determining whether or not you have enough money that exists in the kitty so it can last for the lifetime anticipated. That really, because you don't have an awful lot of range in the other stuff. The budget is what's going to drive it. But I do wish to also indicate that the retirement budgets tend to look out, as shown here, if you will, with 25 years. Things change so much in a life that it's nice to have a gauge as to where you are now and something reasonably realistic to gather for your current asset base, or for simply to get it to grow to an asset base that would cover, that period of time. You just got to recognize that the returns have changed a lot. The inflation is down by a considerable margin from what I used before. It just look at 25 years, but don't really plan for anything more than 5 years without redoing this. In fact, I would say, depending on the economic scenarios, to do it all over again, and then you will find that the kitty will be different and that you would have to adjust your asset allocation. This budget that we're going through, I absolutely state is not perfect, but it is so much better than just having a guesstimate that you're looking at a questionnaire and you have to fill it out then, supposedly. No, you're going to have to spend some time, which is what you're doing now. The other part of it is, I don't see this used as much as in the previous decades, where they all, Money Magazine, whatever the case would be, would just have some flat number that you could use. Just use 60 or 70 or 80% or even 100% of your current budget. Well, the current budget wasn't really thought out, but I don't think you see that often. If you do see it, I think you ought to put a hold on doing on going further with the retirement asset and the spitting out an asset allocation. And I would just say no. You really got to do the budget. Admittedly, I have a difficulty now, as does everyone else, when you come over to healthcare expenses. That is tough. You'll see it coming up. You'll also see long-term care. No way of getting around this, but you do the best you can. At least you do the best you can by going through the budget. Now, if you're using Quicken or something like that, you're probably miles ahead of a lot of other people, but in any case. So this is not the end, it's just the end of Module 1, and then we'll pick up on the formal budget from there.